Can art save the world? A constant work in progress. You will notice that I have not tried to define art. That is because our perception of what art is changes all the time. It becomes enlarged by rebels. If I would hint at a definition, I would say function, when the genius of function is exceeded. If you sharpen a stone for killing animals, that is function. But if you sharpen a stone and create in it patterns that add nothing to its function, that is the beginning of art. It is expression that transcends function. That is why the most artistic works appear useless. There's always a pressure to place art under the service of function. But the more it is functional, the less it is artistic. The artistic is in excess of the functional. That is the aesthetic sense. But then we're still limited in what we consider functional. I believe that the aesthetic is functional in a higher sense. I believe that the mind craves beauty, that the soul is nourished by beauty. Function serves the body, but beauty serves the soul. That is why culture embraces both, encompasses both. Culture is both functional and aesthetic. It serves both the body and the soul. Culture serves the social cohesion of man. And by man here, I mean man and woman. I don't want to keep saying man and woman all the time. It becomes much longer. Culture springs from the identity of a people, the unique way a people express themselves, the special way a people celebrate their identity. Culture may be imposed. Culture may just emerge. But it is a people's unique slant on the universe. Culture is the artistic spirit in the service of identity and cohesion. The functionality of art has long been a hotly debated trope. Must art be functional? There are those who insist that art can only be art if it does something noticeably useful. This attitude was at its height during the sweep of socialism. The usefulness of art was its mantra. But this idea of the usefulness of art limits not only art, but the artistic spirit. Besides, usefulness is limited to the idea of use prevalent in that era. Socialist art insisted that art be realistic and that it serve the revolution, and that it reflect, in realistic terms, the working class and their preoccupations. But the casual perusal of socialist art now shows how wooden that art often was. I visited a museum in Estonia and saw socialist art from when the country was part of the Soviet Union, and most of it was pretty stiff and lifeless. And it had dated terribly next to the art that was done more freely and which was frowned upon at the time. I find it interesting that both the communists and the Hitlerian fascists outlawed modern art and saw modernity and experimentation and waywardness as a threat to be stamped out. They were both threatened by what seemed useless in true art, by the fact that it could not be tamed, it could not be manipulated to their cause, it could not be used. The less a work of art can be used, the more artistic it is. Again, we return to this idea. Contemporary governments are trying to compel everything to be of immediate and visible use. They support projects that are useful. They encourage funding to projects that prove to be immediately useful. They demand proof of the use of funding. This attitude has led indirectly to the disappearance of libraries across Britain. This attitude has led to an art that shows its communal value. There's nothing wrong with that. But compelling art to be immediately valuable is the beginning of the death of art. What do we know of the value of anything? What do we know of the value of art? We still do not know what art really is. 200 years ago, African sculpture was seen as satanic objects, and the infamous auto da fe of African art objects which were burnt in Benin by the British in the 19th century, the century of Dickens and Baudelaire, is proof of this. This idea extended throughout the world. We define art in relation to ourselves, our groups, our tribe, our race, our ideology, our religion, our politics, our limitation. But art is greater than all these limitations. Art lives beyond the limitations. Art is the expression of the soul against the limitations of the mind. Art is always rebellious. It always rebels against boundaries. Its first rebellion is against function and use. That is why our ancestors, our distant millennial ancestors, always made their art out of useless things. They beautified stone, wood. Later on, they beautified gold. But they made beauty out of what was to hand. They took simple, ordinary things and raised their vibration. They worked magic on the ordinary. They painted their bodies. They painted their faces. They created alternative faces. They made masks. They turned lightning into a god. They deified darkness. They turned the fact of light into a potent myth. The artistic instinct is a transforming instinct. It is the natural alchemy of man. The transforming of things is the transformation of the mind. To raise something is to raise oneself. In this way, art is intimately linked to civilization. That is why art is at the heart of the civilizing instinct. That is why to limit the idea of art is to limit the idea of civilization. To limit art is to limit freedom. Art is the greatest evidence of our freedom, of our sense of order, of our impulse to grow. Where there is art, there is hope. Where there is free and vigorous art, there is always hope for a people, no matter what their external circumstances appears to be. A people without art is like a tree that is already dead, but that is still standing. Art is the boldness of the soul of man. Art is the great adventure of the intelligence of man. I spoke about transformation as the heart of what art does. What greater transformation is there than the transformation of the ordinary? To take the ordinary and to lift it, transfigure it, that is art at its highest. To make something out of nothing is godlike in its power. That is why to go beyond use, to go beyond function, to go beyond utility is the highest in art. It takes us beyond ourselves. It takes us beyond our limitation. It takes us beyond our conception of what we are. In our times, we are too taken with that which we can define. We have regressed into a people of mere evidence. Prove it to me, we say. Show it to me, we cry. Make it evident, we demand. But making evident is the easiest achievement of the human race. We have been proving and making evident now for millions of years. We have been showing, we have been making useful, making functional since we discovered fire and the wheel. That is one impulse, and it's an invaluable one. But inside that impulse is a greater one, the going beyond impulse, the impossibility impulse, the seeing further impulse, the impulse for the unknown. Fire was not discovered because someone in ancient times wanted to roast meat. It was discovered accidentally, I conjecture. Someone noticed something unusual. Let's pause there. Someone noticed. Someone saw. Someone saw what others didn't. Someone paid attention. Someone did something unusual. The first fire maker must have seemed a person of magic, a person endowed with the power of the gods. The fire cults in history must have continued this reverence for the magic of fire. Fire itself is transformation. Something extraordinary is happening to something ordinary. Quickly, it became a symbol, a mystical principle, a metaphor. We use fire for 1,000 things now, but at the beginning, fire must have been tinged with magic. What do we know of the use and function of art? We discover its functions and its possibilities every day. Now they use art as therapy. They use art for the treatment of depression. They use art for dealing with autism. They use art in dealing with those who are perceived of as mad. They use it to teach children. They use it for those in a coma. They use art even for the dead. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks and the ancient Africans used art for the unborn. Everywhere we use art for the unknown. Science rules our age, but science has its limitations. Science can't deal with the soul. Science can't help us deal with the unknown. Science is mute in relation to death. Science is dumb with that which it cannot understand. Science is limited to our understanding, our measuring, our calculating. If we can't measure, calculate, or analyze it, then science is useless. But only art can deal with that which we cannot analyze, that which we cannot measure, that which we cannot compute. Only art can deal with the immeasurability of the human heart. Only art can deal with the unfathomability of the human soul. Only art can deal with the deep unease that runs through us and which has no name. It can take the form of a profound ennui that sweeps an age. It can take the form of a sense of emptiness that takes over a people. Sometimes we don't know what's happening to us as individuals or as a people. We can wander in the wilderness of our daily lives and not know what we're experiencing. But art gives it a form, gives it a shape, gives it a song, shows it indirectly in a story, releases it in music. Art helps us see in the darkness of our days. It is the higher eyes of a people, its higher ears. It is the sixth and seventh sense of a civilization. For this reason, art is always social, always communal, even when it appears most individualistic. What one soul sees truly, it sees for all of us. What one soul shapes truly, it shapes truly for all of us. Who would have thought that the curious shapes of Basquiat's paintings, so reminiscent of the shape-making impulse of the cave painters, would embody contemporary malaise and anxieties? Who knows the destiny of forms? Who can say what a shape, a gesture in dance, a confusing passage in a novel, a broken syntax in poetry, a noise in music, who can say what it will mean in times to come? Who can determine the destiny or meaning of a dance? Who can figure out the eventual meaning of what seems a meaningless story? We think that a figure like Duchamp widened the possibilities of art by including in art the possibilities of found objects, by indicating the fact of art in objects perceived, by expanding art to the body, to performance, and so on. But I would suggest that there's not a single aspect of Duchamp's discovery that was not already there in ancient times. A casual visit to an exhibition of prehistoric art, whether in Africa or in Stone Age Europe, will astonish you at how Duchampian our ancestors were. In Egypt, at Saqqara, I gazed into a hole in a wall and saw in a hidden room a man seated in a chair. His name was T. I wrote a poem about him. That work prefigured Duchamp's installation in Pennsylvania by 3,000 years. My point is that we expand our idea of art, that as we expand our idea of art, we find that the art impulse has been with us in ways we did not suspect. In art, our boats beat backwards. We make new only to find that we are making old. The art mind is the wonder mind. It saw gods in lightning, gods in thunder, gods in time. The art mind saw the body as art and elaborated one of the oldest arts of all, the art of dance. Is there any art stranger and more apparently useless than dance? Will the movement of the body in certain rhythms feed us? Will it help us in the hunt? Will it put a roof over our heads? Will it shelter us from rain and snow? Can its value be measured? And yet, what art is more human, more intimately bound with the unity of body and soul? Of all the forms of art, that of dance is the most mysteriously universal. Everywhere, in all lands under the sun, the people express their reality, their presence, through rhythmic motions of the body. With this motion, they shape their relationships with the gods, with the seasons, with the full moon, with the enigma of death, the mystery of birth, and the cycles of time. With the older civilizations, dance was a human being's intimate connection with the universe. Dance takes us back to the primacy of art in human evolution. For a moment, let's reverse the question. Not can art save the world, but did art shape the world? Anthropology is unable to separate the earliest artifacts of man from the earliest art of man. It seems that when our ancestors shaped an object for a function, that object took on a special meaning. It seems that to make is to confer a higher quality on something. To make makes us. We are different when we shape. We affirm that we can shape our world. So art may have begun dimly as function, but the act of making something into something else was the earliest and most mysterious sense of our creative powers. It was imposing our will on the world through the faculty of imagination under the overpowering force of necessity. Whatever else it is certainly turning something ordinary into something else. The emphasis is on the turning. In the most primitive stage of the career of humanity, life was always a battle with the elements. In that battle, our ancestors slowly accommodated themselves to the world through modest acts of discovery. And that discovery was fundamentally creative. Alongside this accommodation was also something else that can't be ignored in the career of man through the millennia. Our most ancient ancestors found themselves in a universe which they could not control. They found themselves in a vast space with hostile and benevolent forces. Thunder frightened them, lightning terrified them, and darkness was a constant source of mystery. And equally mysterious and wonderful was the return of light with each new day. This sense of terror and wonder are our earliest legacies. To accommodate themselves to a universe that was beyond their comprehension depended on something primal. They developed a magical sense of the universe. They did not really develop it. The sense of the magical was embedded in the universe. It was embedded in our consciousness. So the earliest art and artifacts of humanity went hand in hand with the magical nature of the universe. First, thunder, lightning, floods, earthquake, night, sunrise, hunger, birth, death, sexuality, food, trees, plants, animals, blood, they all seem like things caused by an invisible power. And magic is linked to that sense of the inexplicable. Stupa. I mean religion in its purest sense, as seeing the world as something inexplicable, its forces beyond our understanding, and our sense of wonder and terror everywhere alive. The universe seen as animated and living, man at his most vulnerable before it, most naked, most fearful. So art shaded into religion and became its chief instrument. Then the dance was as much an act of expression as it was a summoning of the ancestors or the appeasing of the gods. The codifying of natural forces into gods is the heart of myth. But before this codifying, there was another impulse, nameless and formless, which led our ancestors further into the path that would later be called civilization. And that impulse was a fundamental impulse of storytelling. I believe that the impulse to tell stories gave rise to language, and not the other way around. We are storytelling beings. Consciousness is permeated with narrative impulse. It is in our DNA. We tell stories in gestures, in grunts, in facial expressions, with movements. We tell stories on cave walls. We tell stories in silence. There's a big story going on here now amongst us. We perceive the world in a narrative way. The flow of time and events, the forms of change, mutations, genesis, and death are all unavoidable aspects of the world. We grow old, our bodies change, we die. These are all narrative elements embedded in this world of perpetual change. We perceive these things. We fight, we go to war. We are overcome, or we overcome. These things have always happened to us in a world of change. The world as narrative, our lives as narrative, has always impinged on us. We are primarily storytelling and story acted upon beings. Language, I contend, rose out of a need to name and express aspects of this vast narrative universe in which we live and have our being. Life as narrative was the pressure, but language as expression was the result. With language, our accommodation with the universe progressed immeasurably. I have said elsewhere that man's oldest technology is not the discovery of fire or the wheel. It is storytelling. It is narrative. It is magical thinking. It is the distant beginning of science. Art came first. Art is a primal response to the universe. The art sense is at the root of observation, and this is the root sense of science, of analysis, and of the manipulation of our discoveries. But language was the great leap. But language is art too. Language is primarily poetical. To find a sound for an object is to translate the world into something else. To call this land that we are standing on, Belgium, was to transform the earth and the land into something else in that single word. It is to find that which resonates it. To name a thing is an intimate way of touching it. To name is poetry. So, we're coming back to the same points. Language is a magical operation as well. It is mysterious, metaphysical, symbolic, psychological. The ancient Egyptians saw language as sacred. The ancient Greek saw language as coming from the logos. Language is a great creative principle. As we name our world, so we are. We are what our language is. Our world changed when we acquired language. More than a tool, it is a kind of a maker of reality. I have written a great deal about storytelling. But through language and through stories, we found a way to bend the world to our consciousness. Stories became the repository of what the human race has learned in its millennia of wandering the dust and darkness of the earth. Through stories, we began to domesticate everything. The gods, the fearless, the inexplicable, the mysterious, the dreaded, the hated, the inimical, the inimical, I've got to get these right, found a place, a form, and a home. The stories may have been simple, they may have been complex, but they had a powerful psychic function. They were our living dreams. Through stories, we learnt, we dreamt, we imagined, we projected, we analyzed, we understood, we prophesied. Stories prepared us for experience. They helped us absorb experience. Once we had grasped something in story, we could begin to overcome it in life. But stories change as people change. But the nature and magical function of stories never change. Remember I said earlier that narrative is woven into our consciousness. We shape stories and we live stories. Science perceives this singular story in one way, religion perceived it in another. But these are all models of perception. We can no more escape our story-making consciousness than we can escape breathing. An individual is the story they tell themselves and believe. A nation is a story that it tells itself and believes. So we are secret stories. We are what our stories has made us. Our stories are the secret patterns of our mind, our subconscious. When a people want to destroy another people, they begin to destroy them first in stories. We are creating stories that create or destroy our world all the time. We think that stories are harmless, but our stories are the invisible armies we send out for good or for evil. We have come to think of ourselves as such rational people that we have come to ignore the primal power of stories. At the deepest level of our beings, our secret stories are at war. Are we a chaotic people riddled with corruption, unable to impose order on our national life? Then a story of chaos is at work deep in our psyches. Do we fear foreigners and have an inexplicable horror of the other, the black, the Indian, the Jew, the Muslim? Then a secret story of race, of the other, a secret dread is at work deep in our psyches. And one day it would erupt in acts of national horror that would surprise future generations. Have you become a cold and unemotional people? Then a secret story of coldness is at work in the cellars of the nation. It seems so evident to me that we are our secret stories, our secret and sometimes unknown stories. It seems evident that we are the working out of some embedded pattern or narrative glyph. We are what we have secretly programmed ourselves to be out of our response to our national or personal history. And sometimes, or more often, it is not a response, but a deliberate creation, a deliberate programming of stories meant to make us into that which they want to make us to be. One has only to think of the stories fed out by the Third Reich, stories fed out by the Tutsis, stories fed out by tribes against tribes across Africa and across Europe, stories fed out against races, against foreigners, against people of different color. Sometimes these stories are planted into the ears of children, and children grow up with them as absolute facts of the world, as true as gravity or sunlight. For many years, I have been puzzled by the almost instinctive fear of black people in Europe. Even in people I know well and like, and who like me, this fear, this suspicion, manifests itself in unexpected ways. I have noticed a phenomena that saddens me, and I've wondered about its root. It's a simple thing, really. Nothing as deadly or as bad as not being given a room by a landlord, or not being given a job when you turn up for an interview, or the persistent negative image of black people in the movies. Nothing like that. Something simple, like going down the road in broad daylight along my own street in London, and people deliberately crossing the road to avoid you. This is consistent. This is my street we're talking about. And this is sometimes with all ages. They see you from a distance, and then they cross the road. For a long time, I wondered. Then recently, I had a solution. I used to think that it was deliberate. Now, I think it's unconscious. They don't know that they're doing it. They do it unconsciously. All the ancient stories of racial perception, all the stories of muggings, burglaries, attacks, all the new specters of Muslims, terrorists, all of these stories have each added a layer to the stories working in secret in the psyches of a people. And so racism among even very decent people becomes unconscious, instinctive, with its source beyond the reach of thought. This is not to say that there isn't plenty of conscious racism, but its prevalence has its root in the unconscious. Its roots are fed by stories and rumors, stories once passed on as facts, rumors never challenged. Art has its source in the unconscious. Its greatest effect is in the unconscious too. We can change the world only if we change the stories at work in the depths of our psyche. But it must be a deep change.